All right, today's video is on Acts 27. Acts 27 is a huge narrative. It discusses Paul going to Rome to appear before Caesar, and we've seen Luke kind of picture Paul as some things of Christ in some very similar manners. Some of the ways are these three trials. So just like Jesus, Paul is brought before a Jewish council, then he's taken before Romans, and then he's taken before someone from the Herod dynasty. So those three folks are really in structure and in line with people that we see happening in the Bible. And I really think the book of Revelation shows the same thing, where we have a sea beast who is Rome, a land beast who is probably this Herod dynasty, these apostate Jews being the false prophet through the mouth of which that's spoken. Paul is taken from the Sanhedrin, then he's taken to Felix, then he appears before Festus. And in Acts 26, when he's with Festus, Agrippa comes along, Herod Agrippa II, and they essentially end in Acts 26 by saying, we find absolutely no fault with this man. So there's no fault found in him, but still he has to go and appear before Caesar because Paul pleaded as a Roman citizen to go to see Caesar, so he has that right and he'll get to do so. So in Acts 27, Paul is on this ship. They're having some great difficulties. It's a pretty good journey to get all the way over there, and eventually we'll see the outcome, but there's a theme that gets presented here, and I want to talk a little bit about it. Now, if we've got this similar thought with Christ and Paul, then we ought to be able to pick up on some of these themes. We've already seen that Luke in his gospel took Jesus on these journeys. Then he pictures Paul's three missionary journeys that he took. Now we've got the three great trials, just like Jesus had these three trials before those members. But there are more themes that we pick up, and it's a Passover and judgment theme. So judgment of God is always good for his people. We don't fear his judgment as the people of God. But for all those who are outside of God, who are not in Christ, then that is a fearful time. They're not in covenant with God. And this starts all the way back at the Passover in Exodus chapter 12. So Exodus is the story where the lambs are killed and the blood's poured over and applied to the doorpost. And on the 14th day is when this begins, and they'll eat for 7 days unleavened bread. And that's our picture of us. We connect it obviously to the Lord's Supper and to communion, and it symbolizes us being passed over because Christ is the bread and the wine is his blood. So on the 14th day, and if you remember from Exodus 12, that this plague, that this death angel comes, and this happens at midnight. So at midnight, the death angel passes through, kills the firstborn Egyptians, but all of the Hebrews are left living. And then in Numbers chapter 9, we see on the 14th day, this begins again, and God continues this structure all the way out through this Jewish history. And really, even before this Jewish history starts, we see a midnight theme in the book of Genesis. So midnight, judgment, night, bread, the whole thought is there. In Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, you can read about the story where the angels come down and it's night, and they're going to pass this judgment on the wicked men of Sodom. Then they're going to partake of unleavened bread is what Lot's going to feed them. Then at sunrise, it pictures Lot and his family leaving the city and dawning of the next day and them surviving the judgment, which is the exact same thing that we see in the Exodus in the next morning that the Israelites get to leave. If you read the story of Jacob, you'll also read about Jacob wrestling with God at night. So Jacob wrestles with God. This judgment passed is good, and Jacob is blessed. Then at the morning, he's appeared limping over the top of the hill. And it's the same theme that's carried all the way through, and it gets picked up even by Jesus in the upper room. So it's at night. They're having the Passover meal. Remember, Judas leaves. You were supposed to take this in the house. If you leave, then that's a picture of death and being outside the covenant, and that's exactly what Judas was. So Luke picks this up in Acts 27. Now, I'll be honest, I haven't heard anybody preach Acts 27 just as a sermonizable deal. If you go to a conference, you're not going to hear somebody say turn to Acts 27 probably, because it's really hard to preach from the pulpit. Now, I'm sure John MacArthur did it because he preaches everything, but this appears to be a difficult task, although we see this theme. And I want you to picture this because Paul's on a ship, and essentially he's on a ship that's going to go down. And he tells these guys, look, unless you stay in this ship with me, you're going to be in trouble. But that's a picture of God's sovereignty and wanting to get Paul before Caesar. It's a picture of God's sovereignty and wanting him to appear there before them. And we really find this Passover and this judgment theme picked up here. But there's nothing for God's people to fear whenever there's judgment. So I'm going to start in Acts 27, and I'm going to pick up in verse 27. And it says, "Now when the 14th night had come," no coincidence, "as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea about midnight," again, not a coincidence, "the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little farther, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea, under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved.' Then the soldiers cut away the ropes in the skiff and let it fall off. And as day was about to dawn," again, sunrise, next day, dawning, not a coincidence. "As day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, 'Today is the 14th day. You have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you.'" This sounds like the Exodus and that night. 14th day, midnight, all of that, this judgment passing through. Those who stay in the ship, they're going to be saved. "Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from your head." And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. And he takes communion. And it's the exact same picture. What is this a picture of? Well, the judgment of God. We've seen this already once in the book of Acts. I think I can find it right quick. It's in Acts chapter 20. It's when Paul's preaching, and he's been preaching all night, and he's up in this upper room, which, by the way, we moved from mountains in the Old Testament to upper rooms in the New Testament. That's also a theme, so note that. In verse 7, it says this, Paul ministering at Troas. "And on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together. And in a window sat a certain young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep. He was overcome by sleep, and as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the 3rd story and was taken up dead." So he's fallen out the window, essentially falls out of the place, just like they would have got off the ship, so he dies. But Paul went down and fell on him, embracing him, and said, "Do not trouble yourselves, for his life is in him." Now, when he had come up, he had broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even till daybreak, and then he departed. And they brought the young man in alive, and they were not a little comforted. So that's the exact same picture. Let me give you one more from the book of Acts and this midnight thing. And we find it whenever Paul and Silas are imprisoned. All right, and we read this. So Paul and Silas are thrown in jail, and they begin to sing. You might remember they were singing the hymns. And in verse 25 in Acts 16, it says this. "But at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening. Suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prisons were shaken. And immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's chains were loosed. And the keeper of the prison, awakening from sleep, seeing the prison doors open, supposing the prisoners had fled, drew his sword and was about to kill himself. But Paul said with a loud voice, 'Do yourself no harm, for we're all here.'" That's another picture. God's going to set his people free. He's going to set them in judgment. The book of Revelation, we see the exact same thought, that it's the darkest hour, that it's at night, and that this judgment is coming. But then at morning, who appears at morning? Well, we read at the end of the book, Jesus Christ is the bright and morning star. So coming up over that hill. As the people of God, we have no need for judgment and fear, because when the judgment comes, we will be passed over because of Jesus Christ. And that's a pure reality that we all need to live in. I think that's a great lesson that needs to be learned from Acts 27. As much history and detail are in there about all the places that Paul went on that boat ride over to Rome. That's something that I think we can take away that's practical, that can give us confidence that because of Christ, that because of this Passover lamb, that when the judgment of God comes, his people have no need to fear.